Hello, and welcome to part 3 of Astronomy 20 Online's discussion of eclipses. In this section, I'm going to teach you a little bit about the anatomy of shadows. Shadows are super important because shadows are what are responsible for eclipses. So in order to understand why eclipses look the way they do, we have to understand a little bit about shadows. So before we get into discussing what shadows look like and their general anatomy, let's go ahead and talk a bit about eclipses. So just to refresh your memory, a solar eclipse happens when the moon passes between the sun and the earth. So here's the sun, here's the moon. That was a bad moon. Let's try that again. Here is the moon, and here is the earth. So sun, moon, earth, that is our solar eclipse. A lunar eclipse happens when the earth crosses between the sun and the moon. So here's our sun, here is the earth, and here is our moon. Now, of note, of course, this is not drawn to scale. Like, these are not scale drawings of the earth, the sun, and the moon. If they were, the sun would be very, very big and very, very far away. So what we're talking about here is how the shadow of the moon falls on the earth, or how the shadow of the earth falls on the moon. So you can imagine that, if here's the sun and the sun is emitting light in all directions, part of that light is going to fall on the moon and create some sort of shadow, or fall on the earth and create some sort of shadow. So I want to show you how you can figure out what those shadows look like. So we're going to start by drawing a few circles. So let's start with a circle for the sun. The sun is quite big, so I'm going to draw a huge circle for the sun. And then there is some object. So either this object is the moon or the earth. It doesn't really matter. So this over here is the sun. And this here is some sort of object. Either earth or the moon. We don't really care which object. The anatomy of the shadow works the same for both. Let's go ahead. No, that's fine. Okay. So what we got to do is we have to figure out where the sun is visible and where the sun is not visible. So if I were looking at the sun is emitting light in all directions. But in order for me to see the sun, I actually need to take a look at what the sun light is doing. So any rays coming from the top of the sun, and actually we don't want these rays to come from there, we want them to come from here. Any rays coming from the top of the sun are visible everywhere except when they are blocked by whatever this object is. If this object is in the way, you won't be able to see the top of the sun. So if I'm standing, down over here, I can see the top of the sun. But for example, if I were standing somewhere along the line over here, I would not be able to see the sun. The planet would be in the way, and the top of the sun would not be visible. Notice that the bottom of the sun, which I'll draw in a different color, let's use blue for the bottom. Notice that the bottom of the sun is visible here. So the bottom of the sun would be visible, but the top would not be. So what we're going to do is we're going to define a region a region behind the object where you will not be able to see the sun at all. And in doing that, we're basically going to define where an eclipse can occur. So if we take a look at everything in this red cone that I'm about to draw, everything within this red cone is not visible. So if you are standing behind the earth in this location, for example, you would not be able to see the top of the sun. It would not be visible. You would still be able to see the bottom of the sun in certain portions, but that would also depend on where you're standing. We can do the same thing for the bottom. And now let's take a look. If you were standing in this region over here, you would be able to see the top of the sun, but you would not be able to see the bottom of the sun. If you were in this region over here, you would be able to see the bottom of the sun, but not the top of the sun. If, for example, you were standing in this region here, right where those two cones intersect, you would not be able to see the sun at all. And if you were, say, back here, you would be able to see the top and bottom of the sun, but the middle of the sun would be blocked. These different locations are where we find our eclipses. So we have another object, and I'm going to go ahead and use a shaded object here. And depending on where this object falls, so in this case, the surface of the object falls partially in the top region, partially in the bottom region, and partially in the middle. In this case over here, the entire surface falls in that region where you can see the top and bottom, but not the middle of the sun. If that region is up here, you can only get a partial look of the sun. Same thing for down here. So based on where the other object is placed, you will either have a total eclipse, a partial eclipse, or an annular eclipse for the solar eclipse. And then there are also a few different eclipse types for the lunar eclipse. We'll get to that in a second. So for example, if you were on Earth and the Earth were located here, if you were in this region that's within the intersection of those two cones right here, you would see a total eclipse. If you were in either the bottom region here or the top region here, you'd be able to actually see part of the sun. And so you would actually not see a total eclipse, you would see a partial eclipse. If you were back in this region, again, the top and bottom here would only see a partial eclipse, but this middle region would see the top of the sun, the bottom of the sun, and not see the middle of the sun. So they would get an annular eclipse. So the different type of eclipse that you see is based on where in this shadow you fall. So we're going to go ahead and label these locations. So the darkest part of the shadow, this middle portion here, let's go ahead and color that in with black, say. This middle portion here, the darkest part, this is called the umbra. And that is the darkest part of the sun's shadow. Let's go ahead and use purple to shade in the next part. So these wings over here, where you can see part of the sun, but not all of the sun, this is part of the sun's shadow, but it's not as dark as the umbra. This is called the penumbra. And we'll use maybe orange for this last bit. So in this last bit where you are just outside the cone of the umbra, this part here, and for some reason your textbook does not label this, this is called the antumbra. So depending on which part of this shadow you fall into, it's going to dictate the type of eclipse you have. If you are in the umbra, you'll have a total solar eclipse. If you fall in the penumbra, you'll have a partial solar eclipse. And if you fall in the antumbra, you will have an annular eclipse. That's it for this section. I'll see you in the next one where we'll talk about these different eclipse types in a little bit more detail. See you there.